We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph in Meseches Nazir. This is Nazir Daf 13a. The Mishnah is discussing an individual who says that if I have a child, then I'm going to be a Nazir. And the Mishnah says, he pila ishto, so if his wife miscarries, eino Nazir. So then he's not going to be a Nazir. Rashi over here says, Hipila ishto eino nazir, the deal mahai de hipila, lo have ben kayama. Maybe the reason why it's a miscarriage is because it really wasn't a viable baby. Shalo kalu lo chadash, if it didn't have the proper amount of months in the womb, velo vlad have, it's not considered a vlad, v'safik nazirus lahakil. And the Tanna Kamma is saying, you have a suffix over here, when we have a suffix by nazirus, we are generally going to be lenient. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Yomer, he should say as follows, Im haya ben kayam, if this was a viable child, Harei ani nazir chover, then I'm a nazir by obligation. V'im lav, and if not, Harei ani nazir nedava, so then I'm going to be a nazir voluntarily. In other words, according to Rabbi Shimon, there is a possibility, even though it's a miscarriage, there's a possibility that this was technically a viable child, and therefore he should make this statement over here that he's going to carry out the nazirus regardless. If this was a child, then he's going to fulfill his obligation with the nazirus, and if not, he'll take upon himself a voluntary nazirus. And Rashi says, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Ein derech zumotziyasu midei nazirus. This is not the way to get out of the nazirus. Elen haya ben kayama hareini nazir chova, v'emlav hareini nazir nedava, dekasavar safek nazirus lahachmer. Because Rabbi Shimon holds that when you have a safek nazirus, we have to be strict. And the Mishnah continues, Chazra v'yolda. Let's say she goes ahead and she has now another child. And Rashi says, Chazra v'yolda la'achar she'pila, meaning after she miscarries, she now has a child. So then Hareza Nazir, so the Tanna Kamma says that the person, the individual, is going to be a Nazir. Rashi says, Hareza Nazir, the Hashtami of Vlad, because that certainly is a child. The slave Chayla Nazirus, so the Nazirus is going to be Chayla. Rabbi Shimon says that in this case, Yomar, he should say as follows. Im Harishon ben Kayam, if the first child was viable, Harishon Chova, so that first Nazirus was the obligation. Vizu Nadav, and this one now is voluntary. Im Lav, and if not, so then the opposite, Harishon Nadava, the first one will be considered a Nadava. Vizu Chova, and the second Nazirus will be considered the one of obligation. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Shema Harishon Hava ben Kayama. Maybe the first child was a viable child. V'chol of Nazirus, and then the Nazirus was Chal then. V'hashta kiyod, and now when there's a second child, Lo Chayil Nazirus, that Nazirus will not be Chal. V'im kidvarecha yasa, therefore Rabbi Shimon says to the Tanna Kamma, if we follow what you're saying, Nim tzazeh, maybe Chulun Lazar, the person on the second Nazirus is not a real Nazirus. He's bringing something to the Azara that's not actually a Korban. Ella rather Yachzor v'yim the Nazirus Shnia. What he should do is do a second Nazirus v'yomer and say as follows: Im Harishon sheipila haya ben kayama Nazirus Harishon echova. If that first child which was miscarried was a viable child, so then that Nazirus was the obligation Nazirus. V'zu nadav, and this one is voluntary. V'im lo haya ben kayama, and if that child was not viable, Nazirus Harishon nadava v'zu chova. So then the original Nazirus, the first one, will be considered voluntary, and this one will be the one of obligation. And the Gemara says, Hi my lememra, this first statement in the Mishnah, where the Mishnah said that if the person says, I'm a Nazir if I have a son, so then if he has a son, he's a Nazir, what do we even need to say this for? It's obvious. And the Gemara says, no, we need it mishum seifa. We need it for what the Mishnah says at the end of that statement. It says, Bas tumtum v'androgenes. Let's say she gives birth to a daughter, or she gives birth to a tumtum, again, a child that we don't know, male or female, or an androgenes is a child who has both the signs of male and female. So in those situations, the Mishnah said, Eino Nazir. The Mishnah said he's not a Nazir, because it ended up that he didn't have a son. And the Gemara says, Pshita, that's also obvious. The Gemara says, no, it's not obvious. Mahu detema, what might you have said? L'cheshe'evnahu to Kamar. Maybe he just didn't mean son particularly. He meant when he's building his family, whatever child it is. Kamash Malan, that's what the Mishnah is teaching the law, that we don't say that if the person said a son, we assume it means a son. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, V'im Amar Kishayeli Vlad V'chulu. If the person said that he's going to be a Nazir when he has a child, so then it includes not only a son, but it would include other children as well. And the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? The Gemara says, no, Ma'u Detema, what might you have said? Vlad Demichshav Beinei Inshi Ba'inan. Maybe when a person says Vlad, it means to say a child that's considered important among men, meaning maybe it really does mean only a son, and if it's not a son, he's not a Nazir. Kamash Malan. So that's what the Mishnah is teaching us. If he says Vlad, it includes other children besides just sons. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Hipila ishto eino Nazir, according to the Tanna Kamma, if his wife miscarried, so he's not a Nazir. As we said when we did the Mishnah, the idea is Safek Nazirus is Lahakil, and that's what the Gemara says. Now, Man Katani La, who's the author of this part of the Mishnah? Rabbi Yehuda, it's Rabbi Yehuda Dekrihu. In the case of the pile that was earlier in the Masechta, It says over here in Rashi, Rabbi Yehuda Damar Le'el the Safek Naziris Lahakil. This is Rabbi Yehuda earlier, that when you have Safek Naziris, we are lenient. Kedaminim Parakam, the Tanya Harini Nazir, Amanas Sheyesh B'Kri Zeh, Kuf Kor V'Halach V'Chulu. Let's say he says, I'm a Nazir. If it turns out that in this Kri we have 100 Kor, then he goes and he finds he can't determine it one way or another. They can't find the Kri or something happens. Rabbi Yehuda matter the Safek Naziris Lahakil. Rabbi Yehuda said that in such a situation it's mutter because we say Safek Naziris Lahakil. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Yomar, the individual should say, Im Hoya ben Kayoma, Hareini Nazir Chova. If that child was a viable child, so then I'm a Nazir out of obligation. V'im lav, and if not, Hareini Nazir Nadava, then I'm a voluntary Nazir. And the Gemara says, Boy minei Rabbi Abba me Rav Huna. Rabbi Abba asked Rav Huna the following question. Hareini Nazir l'cheshayiyah libein. What if a person says, I'm going to be a Nazir when I have a son? V'hipila ishto, then his wife miscarries. V'hivrish carbon, and he separates an animal for carbon in terms of the Nazirus. V'chazra v'yol, and then she goes ahead and she has a second child. So mahu, so what's the halacha? And the Gemara says, Aliba the man. Who is this question according to? Aliba the Reb Shimon. If you're asking according to Reb Shimon, Maiti boile, what's even the question? Ha'amar Reb Shimon, Safek Nazirus, Lahachmar. Reb Shimon said, in a situation of Safek Nazirus, you have to be strict, meaning that the animal, when he first separated it after the miscarriage, according to Reb Shimon, you're supposed to separate animals for the Nazirus, meaning the person is a Nazir, because Safek Nazirus is Lahachmir. So there's no question. Certainly whatever he separated to be used for the karbanos of the Nazir, that's going to be Kadosh. And so the Gemara says, V'yalla aliva to Rabbi Yehuda. Rather, the question is according to Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, he said that when you have a situation of a miscarriage, so there we say, Safek Naziris Lahakil, you don't have to bring any karbanos. And if you have a second child, according to Rabbi Yehuda, so then on the second child, the person is going to be a Nazir. So the question is, aliva to Rabbi Yehuda, Da'amar Safek Naziris Lahakil. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that by a Safek of Naziris, we're generally lenient. So now in this case, the person did separate the animal for that first child, which was the miscarriage. He separated the carbon at that point in time. So the question is, what's the halacha? Kadosh or lo kadosh? Do we say that it's holy, or do we say it's not holy? In other words, according to Rabbi Yehuda, on that second child, certainly the person is a Nazir. But this person separated the animal a little bit early, and at a time when it was a suffix. And so do we say that that first hafrasha, that's considered to have kedusha, it's considered to be a kadosh animal, or do we say it's not kadosh? And the Gemara says, my nafkamina, what difference does it make whether it's kadosh or not? And the Gemara says, legizaso v'lavodbo. The difference is in terms of the shearings of that animal, or to work that animal. If it's kadosh, then those items will be prohibited. The shearings and the working of the animal, the labor of the animal. Otherwise, if it's not kadosh, then that will be permitted. And Rashi over here explains. First, Rashi says, "V'hifresh carbon v'chazra v'yoldu mahu mi'avikadosh alo." Again, is the animal sanctified? Aliba deman kami boila. Who are you asking according to? Aliba de Rabbi Shimon pshita dehavikadosh. According to Rabbi Shimon, it's certainly kadosh. The Amar Safek Naziris lahachmer. He said, when you have a suffix situation, we're strict, and you act as a nazir. V'kodem sheyolda ishto nami have a nazir. He's already a nazir before his wife gave birth to that second child. He's a nazir anyhow. Aliba de Rabbi Yehuda damar Safek Naziris lahakalmai. The question is, what about according to Rabbi Yehuda that after the miscarriage, the individual is not a nazir? Kasafik Naziris is lahakil. Mi'amrin on keben shefrishu b'shah shepila. Do we say as follows? Since he separated the animal at the time of the miscarriage, v'lo chayla ala Naziris klal, and so there was no Naziris then, so lo have a kadosh klal. We should say there's no kedusha at all. Mi'boilei l'mahader v'lekedusha, and he's going to have to go again and make an animal kadosh, make karbanos for the second Naziris. But the Gemara said, "My nafka lachmina." What difference does it make in terms of the first set of animals? You have a kadosh or lo. What difference does it make if the animal is kadosh or not? The hayolda v'chayla le naziris. In terms of naziris, she ended up giving birth to a child. He is certainly going to be a nazir. What difference does it make? And the Gemara answered, "Nafka mina legizaso v'lavabo." The difference it makes is if the animal is kadosh in terms of its shearings, in terms of its labor. V'hachi kami baile. And the question of the Gemara was as follows: Iamrid mishah shehifresh techila kishiyipila havale kadosh. If you're going to say that at the moment that he separated it originally, by the time of the miscarriage, so at that time it was kadosh, so havale aser begiz of avoda, that would mean that this animal, again, it's aser in terms of its shearings and its labor. But if you're going to say that the naziris is not chal after that miscarriage, so it's only going to be chal, the naziris is only chal when she actually gave birth to that second viable child, so then that kedusha on the animal that he separated is nothing. Havale mutter begiz of avoda. avoda, and it would be mutter in terms of the shearings and in terms of the labor. What's the halacha? And teku, that the Gemara leaves as a question. The Gemara does not answer the question. And the Gemara continues, Boy minei ben rechume me Abaya, ben rechume asked Abaya the following question. Hareini nazir l'chesheyeheli ben. Let's say a person says, I'm going to be a nazir when I have a son. V'shama chaveru, and his friend hears him. V'yamr, and he says, V'yolai, it's upon me. So mahu, so what exactly is that friend saying? Adibure mashma, is he going on what he just heard being spoken, meaning he's saying that I too am going to be a nazir if you have a son. O aguve mashma, maybe he's going on himself and he's saying I'm going to become a nazir if I have a son. And the Gemara says, Im timsalomar agufe mashma. If you're going to say when he says v'alai, he's going on himself. He means to say that if I have a son, then I will be a nazir, just like you're going to be a nazir if you have a son. So what about the following scenario? Amar hareini nazir l'chashiyaheli ben. The person says, I'm going to be a nazir when I have a son. V'shama chaver, and his friend hears, v'yamar va'ani, and he says, and I. Instead of saying v'alai, it is upon me, he says I. So in that case, mahu, what's the halacha there? So there you could say, anavshei ka'amar, he's certainly going on himself, meaning he's saying, when I have a son, I'm going to be a nazir. O dilmer, maybe what he means by vi'ani is, hachikamer, here's what he's saying. Rechim nalach kivasech, I love you like you do. Meaning to say, I'm going to be just as happy, that's the va'ani, I will be just as happy when you have a son, and I also will become a nazir. And the Gemara says, imtim tzalomer, and if you're going to suggest, kol ba'anpe, if he's right in front of him, so the idea is certainly if he's right in front of the individual, he's certainly saying, if you have a son, then I'm going to be happy, and I'm going to become a nazir. And we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis.